Okay, so Alexandra heads up the collections information team at Wellcome Collection in London. She's an archivist by training and an invertebrate tinkerer with digital technologies, particularly with any kind of online platform which promises to maximise access and engagement with archive, library or museum collections. She was wrong about Ning and Second Life, but her research background studying crowdsourced transcription and other forms of digitally enabled participation in cultural heritage has come in especially handy over the past year and a half of virtual working from home. Alexandra would like me to say that she's speaking today on behalf of the whole Transcribe Wellcome team, organisers, transcribers and museum partners, and that this talk is presented in gratitude to everyone involved. Her talk is entitled Transcribe Wellcome, Piecing Together the Wellcome Collection's Diaspora. Over to you, Alexandra.
To be part of this, so thank you very much. So my talk today is about Transcribe Wellcome, the work we've been doing over the past year and a half to transcribe archive documentation from the former Wellcome Historical Medical Museum and Library, and how we've begun to map out at the object level the diaspora of Wellcome collections, both present and past, trying to trace their current whereabouts around the world. But I also I want to set out why this work is important to Wellcome Collection, tell you as much as I can in a short time about a very, very large archive, and squeeze in a few slides on the research potential that Transcribe Wellcome is beginning to open up. And a big thank you to all the presenters who've already mentioned Transcribe Wellcome during the conference. It's been really amazing to realise just how far our little lockdown working from home experiment has grown. And the impact that this work's already having. And what I really hope to achieve from today's talk is to persuade anyone from a Wellcome recipient museum who's not already involved to please do get in touch. And all of this is very much following in the footsteps of the Swansea Egypt Centre, of course, who've been our valued partners in this work from BCE, as in before COVID era, and to whom a great deal of credit is due for its success. And then just because all the best things online involve pictures of animals, I'm going to top and tail the presentation with the story of a small cat with a distinctive lean to the left who fits so well with Wellcome's new PowerPoint template. So more on her a bit later. Oh, that would really help if my slides would move properly. In the meantime, a little bit of context for Transcribe Wellcome within the work of Wellcome Collection. Firstly, as was evident from me stumbling over some terms yesterday when I was chairing, I'm not an Egyptologist, I'm not a museum curator, I'm an archivist by background. And as Wellcome's Collections Information Manager, I'm responsible for the team who ensure our current collections are well documented and that they're available for use. So that could mean displayed in our own permanent galleries or on exhibition. It might mean on-demand access in our library, increasingly, of course, digitization, access online, could be used for broadcast or in a commission from our publishing team, for instance. And although we no longer hold large numbers of 3D objects, Wellcome Collection is both an accredited museum and an accredited archive, and our library collections are designated as outstanding, which means we've made some commitments to adhere to certain standards for collections information, including undertaking what's known as collections inventory, which is essentially about ensuring that the collections are properly accounted for. But it also requires us to demonstrate a sort of audit trail between current documentation and records made at the point of collections acquisition. But for Wellcome, inventory was never going to be a straightforward task due to the size and scale of collections made during Henry Wellcome's lifetime and the subsequent dispersal after Wellcome's death of large parts of the museum collection especially, but also some parts of the library collections. And we caught some glimpses of library dispersals in Anna's talk yesterday. And those of you who joined Ruth Horry's talk earlier in the week will already have seen this map of museums dispersals. As Francis Larson points out, since Wellcome's death, entire museums have been founded on a fraction of his collection's treasures. And of course, we can include the 4,500 or so objects sent to Swansea University in that company. In fact, to the best of my knowledge, Antarctica is the only continent which doesn't lay claim to some form of Wellcome object. Although, given that the pharmaceutical business from which Wellcome made all his wealth provided medical supplies to Scott and other explorers, it wouldn't surprise me in the least to hear that Wellcome's material legacy is represented even at the South Pole. Now, the activities of the museum and library, collections purchasing, field collecting from all over the world, exhibition research and display, and the subsequent dispersals of both museum and library materials, these are all documented in nearly 600 boxes full of paper archives, inherited by Wellcome Collection as the modern day successor to the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum and Library. And shown here is just a snapshot of this enormous archive, which documents Wellcome's and latterly the Wellcome Trust's interests in the cultural context of health and medicine from the 1890s to the late 1980s. Ruth in her talk the other day mentioned 56 museum registers, but that's only for the museum. So include the registers covering paintings, photographs, prints and drawings, and those for books and manuscripts. And the total adds up to more than 100 handwritten registers. There are also hundreds of thousands of 6x4-inch index cards, correspondence files, shorthand notebooks, typescript reports. And these archives are the starting point for tracing the provenance of archives still at Wellcome Collection, and of course, those that were subsequently dispersed elsewhere. So what remains in the Wellcome Collection today represents only a small proportion of the former whole as documented in this archive. What's more, although the history of the library is under-researched, and for the most part, it's pretty much absent from published work on the history of Wellcome's collecting, the acquisition, the management, the display histories of the collections themselves are often very strongly intertwined. And that's particularly the case for paintings, which of course hung on the walls of the museum, and many of which are still at Wellcome Collection today. So this, on this slide, there's a double-page spread from one of the paintings registers. The top entry is a Dutch painting, probably depicting a baby's baptism, not particular interest to this audience. The second entry, though, describes a mummy portrait that's now at the Egypt Centre in Swansea. And then I was curious about the final two entries too, because they also depict scenes in Egypt. This was slightly trickier because it turns out we hold 10 paintings from this artist, but nearly 100 years after their acquisition, we've only managed to catalogue 2 of them. So thanks to the efforts of our visual inventory team, I went and photographed the top one this morning. It just has an inventory number at the moment. And so looking for information in the archive on any one item often feels like you're kind of searching for a missing piece from several massive jigsaw puzzles where the shapes have been jumbled up together and then they've been tossed far and worldwide. And yet at the same time, rarely has piecing together these jigsaws seemed quite so urgent, I think. Given that the peak of collecting activity for both museum and library occurred during the 1920s and the 1930s, the power dynamics of the British Empire are highly relevant both to what was acquired for the collections and how it was acquired, by and from whom. A significant proportion of the items collected came from cultures outside of Europe, often drawing directly on relationships built through the Burroughs Wellcome business and transported to London through Burroughs Wellcome's overseas depots, their trade contacts and shipping networks. And don't be misled by the titles either. The Historical Medical Museum especially is much more accurately thought of as an ethnographic or anthropological museum. And it's founded on what today would typically be termed a world cultures collection and displayed as such over time. It's also the case that this colonial legacy is often still visible today at Wellcome Collection and elsewhere, in the uneven distribution of our knowledge about certain parts of the collection, but sometimes also in the information we make available online about them. So whilst the language used in the museum and library archive reflects the period at which these records were written, and one of the things we ask our archive transcribers to do is flag terminology which is racist or offensive. But very often this information has simply been copied and replicated over many years into exhibition labels, into catalogue records and other forms of collections interpretation. And there's another related issue in the agency that's credited to Wellcome himself and to Wellcome's collecting networks, the men who bid at auction, the archaeologists and field collectors, the colonial administrators who sold the souvenirs of their service in the bureaucracy of empire. These are the people who get named and attributed in online collections databases, usually much more prominent in the object's creators, their vendors, or even contemporary local experts who might be knowledgeable about an item's origin, community context, or use. And it's abundantly clear from the virtual postbag we received that there's a strong and growing interest both within and outside of Wellcome Collection in addressing these sensitive and sometimes contentious topics. Not only to understand more about Wellcome's colonial connections at the macro level of our institutional history, but also at the micro level of individual objects' provenance and custodial stewardship. So how, where, when, from whom Wellcome acquired a particular object, or in Wellcome Collection's case, book, painting, manuscript, or so on. And where it's no longer at Wellcome, to understand its subsequent onward journey through sale, exchange, loan, or gift. And it was precisely in order to facilitate this kind of research that the Museum and Library Archive was digitised, and it's been available online since late 2017. And I put a link on this slide to the collection reference and the landing page for the archive catalogue. Before 2017, provenance research for a single object could take weeks. It could still be inconclusive, even for those of us who knew where to start. And digitisation dramatically reduced access times, but the non-searchable handwritten and typescript text in archive records like the ones on this slide, often they're heavily annotated, they're dog-eared through use, coupled with multiple overlapping, frankly downright confusing, different documentation systems used over the course of time by the museum and library. All of this meant that the archive remained fairly opaque, quite unfathomable to all but the most intrepid of researchers, people like Ken. The archive has also been successively rearranged as a result of the 20th century dispersals process. I'm not expecting you to squint at these flowcharts, although I am very happy to send them out later to anyone who might find them useful. But I included them on this slide really to give an impression of the convoluted twists and turns, the crossroads, the dead ends that the researcher has to navigate in seeking to trace the provenance of items from the Wellcome collections. And these diagrams only represent a pretty basic research journey through the most obvious parts of the archive. This isn't the sort of detective work that Ken's engaged in some of his work, for instance, in tracking down the Hilton Price collection, for example. And from the perspective of the museums who received objects from the Wellcome collections, those challenges regarding the archive documentation were then often magnified further by several different other factors. Firstly, the extended timeframes over which dispersals occurred. So you had different staff responsible at different points in time with different knowledge about the dispersals process. Also by the practice of using intermediary organisations to help with the distribution, and we heard yesterday a lot about the redistribution via the Peachey Museum at UCL of a lot of the Egyptian material. And then some simple practical things like the most common means of labelling having involved parcel tags tied on with string, which of course fell off objects. Sometimes they were removed during sorting. And even where a label stayed attached, the details recorded are heavily abbreviated. They're almost cryptic sometimes in the way that they're set out. And objects were sometimes sent on sight unseen, very often with little or little accompanying documentation often at best a 6x4-inch index card, which would be sent separately to the objects themselves, sometimes some decades afterwards. And in any case, there were multiple different series of these index cards in existence, and often critical details appear in only one series, which may or may not have been the version that was sent on to the recipient. So all of that combined with what's become quite a well-worn narrative about the disorder of the museum collections at Wellcome's death in 1936 gives rise to misconception is not quite the right word, but I think it's interesting when I speak to curators at recipient museums. They're often surprised that an archive relevant to their collections exists at all at Wellcome Collection. They're very often assumed that the only available documentation will be written, that what they find written on a few brief lines on index cards that they have in their possession. Now, I do need to be careful not to completely downplay the frustrations with this archive. Certainly there were documentation backlogs. Acquisition at Wellcome always has, possibly always will, outpace the capacity of the museum and library staff to keep up with accessioning. But then backlogs of documentation have been a fact of life in every museum, library and archive I've ever worked in too. And that's why inventory is a mandatory commitment under the accreditation schemes, of course. And when you're expected to register 16,000 objects in a year, as Wellcome's museum staff did in 1936, it's not really possible to go into a lot of detail. So often records were simply copied from whatever information was already available verbatim. And typically that would be a terse, sometimes highly inaccurate one line from an auction house sales catalogue. And there are some significant holes in the archive too, including one elusive sequential run of more than 100,000 museum accession cards, which are of particular relevance to Egyptological material. So if anyone's got them in their museum, I would really love to hear from you. But having worked very closely with the archive over the past 18 months, I'm starting to understand much more about how the documentation was organised, how it was reorganised, and then how it was itself redistributed. And actually, I'm increasingly confident that we will in time manage to close down many of these gaps. And so the impression that's built up of a thinly described, poorly managed collection is both in some senses and at certain periods true. And I think it's particularly true during the period of Wellcome's lifetime. But at the same time, it does a real disservice, I think, to the Wellcome staff who made successive attempts over many years, and particularly after Wellcome's death in 1936, to improve the quality and detail of the collection's documentation, as evidenced, of course, by the substantial archive left behind from their endeavours. And if you start to think of the index cards themselves as part of a process of inventory, then the comprehensiveness of what they had to achieve here across the range of these quite enormous collections begins to shine through. This is one of my favourite index cards, not least because rather against the odds, we successfully tracked down one of the pins described here to Durham University. But also, I think it demonstrates a rather appealing democratic quality to the accessioning process at Wellcome. Here we have a couple of essentially unremarkable pins. One of them's broken. They were bought as part of a mixed lot at Sotheby's in November 1928, but they've been given their own index card, just like the most prized and valuable object. And so in early 2020, a plan was hatched to start to transcribe these fundamental records of collections provenance and dispersal. And the aim is to make sure that the text that's currently locked within hundreds of thousands of typescript and handwritten records, to make sure it's fully searchable, and to open up new research entry points into the fuller richness of the archive. Now, as it happens, my PhD research studied motivations to participate in collaborative archive transcription projects. So I've had a fantastic year working on this project. I didn't take a lot of persuasion, and when lockdown hit in March last year, I think we were in a really good position to move quickly to set up a work from home project. We're using relatively low-tech ways of doing this, as spreadsheets and transcribing from the records online. Ken was very keen to transcribe the museum index cards, so these became our first transcription work stream. But from there, the project's basically mushroomed, and it's now firmly established with the inventory team at Wellcome Collection, working as coordinators and as quality control checkers. Currently, we're working across 4 different transcription work streams, one for the museum, the library, the photography accession registers, and then also the transit registers, which record the very final phase of dispersals beginning in the 1970s. We recently passed the 100th person to help transcribe mark. We've run an online transcribe-a-thon. We hope to run more. I think there's a little bit of enthusiasm after, I hope there is after this conference, to run another one fairly soon. And over this summer, actually, we've supported 4 extremely successful virtual student projects, placements, combining transcription with in-depth research, making use of the wider archive. And I'm hoping by the end of the year, we'll be closing in on a landmark 50,000 entries transcribed, though there is, as you can see from the bottom of this slide, still quite a way to go yet. As the first completed transcriptions were returned, it quickly became evident that keeping hundreds of separate spreadsheets wasn't going to be very useful. So I started to import the spreadsheet data into a database, which really does open up all kinds of possibilities for data exploration and analysis at scale. Now, obviously, what I'm showing you here are just provisional visualizations based on the data that's currently available. But particularly when the transcribed data from the archive is combined with data from recipient organisations about the current locations of former and present day Wellcome collections, then the database offers a really powerful potential for reconstructing provenance, both at the object level, but also for researching networks of people and objects at scale across time and spanning world geographies. So here's an example of a collector who's come up many times already in this conference, William MacGregor. Wellcome's known to have purchased a quarter of the lots at the MacGregor sale at Sotheby's in 1922. And this report is a screenshot from the database, but the report will automatically update as new transcription is completed and as we receive new data from recipient museums. And a similar one illustrating how we can do this for particular geographies or particular places. This I threw together on Wednesday afternoon. I was curious after Stephanie's talk to see what material from Amana had been transcribed so far, and you can see this actually includes some of the collection presented to Wellcome by the Egypt Exploration Society. We don't know the whereabouts of some of those items yet, though. So if all this sounds useful to you, and I hope it does, the Transcribe Wellcome database is currently a prototype, but access is available on request to the transcribe@wellcome.org address, and please do get in touch to ask. We've been very careful to license all of the transcribed data openly, and I really hope we can make the database available publicly as soon as possible. We're certainly not going to wait until transcription's been completed. We're not quite there yet, but as I say, access is available on request. We've also recently launched a companion website for our own notes, our own kind of research notes, giving an overview of the various documentations systems you'll encounter when using the archive, listing some of the common abbreviations you find on the index cards. We've included some short biographies of staff, mostly thank you to Ruth Horry for those. Biographies of collectors, notes on places and organisations associated with Wellcome's museum and library. There's also a bibliography, information on the diaspora dispersals dataset as it grows in the database, and information, of course, about our transcription guidelines, our transcription standards, and the quality control procedures. We really can't develop Transcribe Wellcome to its full potential without involving many more of you. So particularly if you're a curator or a researcher with an interest in former Wellcome material at another museum or library, We'd love to hear from you at the transcribe@welcome.org email address. Single examples are received with thanks, but I get really excited by messy database exports. What I'm really looking for is concordance data that matches recipients' object numbers to welcome identifiers. And I'm really happy to help with any cleanup that's necessary or data standardization. So do get in touch and we can have a chat about the best formats to supply that information in. I'm also really interested in any welcome documentation you may hold as we try to understand those gaps in the archive at the welcome end. Index cards are probably the commonest thing, but as we saw from Anna's talk yesterday, we're also discovering registers. Some people have sales catalogues. There's very often the other half of the correspondence files that we've got at the welcome end in recipient organisations. And it would be really fantastic if we could find ways to incorporate all of that dispersed welcome documentation into the transcription project in due course. And finally, I mentioned virtual student placements earlier. I think there's probably a potential for a lot more of these. I'd be really interested if you have students or volunteers who might like to do some work with Transcribe Wellcome, or if there are other live areas of research where Transcribe Wellcome might play a useful role. I promised to finish with the tale of a cat. So to conclude, let me return to our little left-leaning feline. On this slide are a couple of images which are currently online on Wellcome Collection's website with absolutely minimal metadata. They originate in a series of photographs taken of objects and displays at the Wellcome Historical Medical Museum, so they almost certainly show an object from Wellcome's former museum collections. And we have also the photographer's register, which is shown on the right, which reveals the photographs were taken in 1938, but actually quite unusually for this register doesn't give an accession or registration number. At some point over Christmas, I remembered that our friends at Swansea had been helping to transcribe a set of previously unitemised accession slips relating to Egyptian material, and it's marked in our archive catalogue as UCL Egyptian material, and then a note not to be relied on. A great deal of this was present in 1983 and went to the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford. So I tried a few speculative searches of the Transcribe Wellcome database for cat. That led me to some hazel catkins, numerous catalogues, but eventually to this index card for A15424, described as one seated cat in stone or hard faience on horseshoe-shaped plinth. And then some purchase details indicating this cat was once part of William MacGregor's collection and purchased at the 1922 auction. So clearly now I needed to look at the Sotheby's sale catalogue to see if this was the right cat. Wellcome does have an annotated copy, but it hasn't yet been digitised. We're currently digitising the sales catalogues. And at this point, of course, we were in lockdown. So Swansea to the rescue again, where not only did Ken have a photocopy of the Wellcome copy of the catalogue, but he'd actually been foresighted enough to scan it. So here's plate 34 from the Sotheby's catalogue showing the cat in question. So now I knew the cat's Wellcome accession number. I still had no idea where she might be now. Ken confirmed she wasn't at Swansea. She didn't seem to be in the Peatrie's online catalogue either. So I started casting around for other possible recipients. And there are apparently 472 cat-related objects held by Durham University museums. It includes the most astonishing collection of early 21st century plush toys from Japan, if you want to have a look. And I was frankly about to give up when suddenly there she was with the earring, the distinctive lean to the left. And even the Wellcome registration details are 187 1942 MCG, standing for MacGregor, painted in white on her bottom. So happily, I can now declare our little cat found. And on that note, I'm compelled to stop, as I often am by a cat. And if I've left enough time, which I probably haven't, I'll ask for questions or I can answer them by text later. And I want also to say thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Alexandra. Really interesting, and it's so lovely to see you asking for volunteers and having student placements too. We don't have any time for questions, but if people want to post their questions in the chat, and then Alexandra can answer them then.